Greetings, everybody. You are listening to the American Exception podcast, and I'm Aaron Good. We are fortunate today to be talking with Jefferson Morley about the latest developments in the JFK assassination, specifically the documents which were released in part yesterday, Thursday, December 15th, though unsurprisingly, the CIA is still withholding many documents after 59 years and counting. What was surprising was seeing Tucker Carlson's story on the case. The story is titled, "Here's What a Source Said About the CIA and JFK's Assassination." The article, which Tucker read on his show on Fox News, contained this passage. "Well, today we decided to find out. We spoke to someone who had access to these still hidden CIA documents, a person who was deeply familiar with what they contained. We asked this person directly, did the CIA have a hand in the murder of John F. Kennedy, an American president? And here's the reply we received verbatim, quote, the answer is yes, I believe they were involved. It's a whole different country from what we thought it was. It's all fake." It's hard to imagine a more jarring response than that. Again, this is not a conspiracy theorist that we spoke to, not even close. This is someone with direct knowledge of the information that once again is being withheld from the American public. And the answer we received was unequivocal. Yes, the CIA was involved in the assassination of the president. Now, some people will not be surprised to hear that they suspected it all along. But no matter how you feel about it or what you thought about the Kennedy assassination, pause to consider what this means. It means that within the U.S. government, there are forces wholly beyond democratic control. These forces are more powerful than the elected officials that supposedly oversee them. These forces can affect election outcomes. They can even hide their complicity in the murder of an American president. In other words, they can pretty much do anything they want. They constitute a government within a government, mocking by their very existence the idea of democracy. As cynical as we have become after 30 years of watching government officials ignore the voters who employ them, we were shocked to learn this. It's not acceptable. Okay, well, of course I am not shocked to hear about any of this information regarding the JFK assassination, but I was shocked to hear it described that way on any mainstream U.S. media outlet. Even more shocking was this passage from Tucker's report. Some people started asking obvious questions about the Warren Commission's conclusion about the two lone nuts in Dallas. It was at this point, as Americans started to doubt the official story, that the term conspiracy theory entered the lexicon. As Professor Lance DeHaven Smith points out in his book on the subject, the term conspiracy theory did not exist as a phrase in everyday American conversation before 1964. In 1964, the year the Warren Commission issued its report, the New York Times published 5 stories in which conspiracy theory appeared. Now today, of course, the term conspiracy theory appears in pretty much every New York Times story about American politics. It's wielded now as then as a weapon against anyone who asks questions the government doesn't feel like answering. But despite 60 years of name-calling, those questions have not disappeared. In fact, they have multiplied with time. Okay, as listeners may know, Lance DeHaven Smith was a dear friend of mine and a mentor as well. He died last month, and at present, I'm about halfway through writing a tribute for him. And it's a challenge because I just had so much admiration and love for the guy that I feel overwhelmed as I do this, but I'm heartened to get this finished, so I hope to have it done before too long. I was already amazed to see the JFK story that we're talking about here get reported the way that it was on Carlson's show. But for Carlson to bring up Lance in a totally appropriate and relevant way, I am just kind of gobsmacked. I know, believe me, I know that Tucker is a right-wing operative, and I'm someone who thinks that the whole of the corporate media are functional or literal CIA assets. The liberal side is the much more nefarious part in my mind, in a way, because they're supposed to be for justice and democracy and such. Murdoch, Fox News, and Tucker Carlson are so pro-empire and pro-capitalism that there would hardly seem to be any need to woo them. But, here we are. It has to be said, putting aside the personage of Tucker Carlson, that on its merits, the story is outstanding in the context of U.S. media reporting on the JFK assassination. I wish Lance were around to see this, but of course I'm going to find myself thinking that a lot, I believe. Anyway, my guest today, Jefferson Morley, is a Washington author and veteran journalist whose novelistic nonfiction books explore untold chapters in the history of the American nation. His newest book is Scorpion's Dance, The President, the Spymaster, and Watergate. His other books include The Ghost, The Secret Life of CIA Spymaster James Jesus Angleton, and Our Man in Mexico, Winston Scott and the Hidden History of the CIA. If you are not already a subscriber and you want to learn more about the hidden history of the U.S. and the clandestine state, please consider subscribing to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. Jefferson Morley, it's great to have you back.
Thanks for having me, Aaron.
So there have been a lot of developments, and you have been kind of at the center of them of late with the JFK Records Act and the deadline that was yesterday, and not everything has been released. What do you make of what has been released? Can you summarize what has been released and what we're still waiting to hear from? What is the state of affairs with all this?
We're talking about a large group of records, 16,000 different records that contain some form of redaction, ranging from a word to a sentence to a paragraph to a page. And they cover all aspects of the assassination story, although there's not much on the crime scene, on forensic evidence. All of that has been made public. And there's not much on sort of secondary issues like JFK's autopsy. But there is a lot of material on the CIA and the FBI. They hold most of the documents that still contain redactions. So what they did yesterday, it's a little bit of a shell game. They make this big show. We released 7,000 documents, in their entirety. That leaves close to 4,000 that still have redactions. And it's not even clear whether the 7,000 figure is accurate, because what we noticed when we went through a batch of about 40 documents last night, one thing that they do is they go through a document and they declassify one sentence. And then they say, we've released that record, although it might have a whole nother page redacted. So, and the most telling example was the one I was most interested in, which is a memo that Arthur Schlesinger wrote to Kennedy 2 months after the Bay of Pigs. And the title of the memo is CIA Reorganization. And anybody who knows the story of Kennedy knows that he was really pissed after the Bay of Pigs. And he reportedly said that he wanted to just break the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. Well, this memo is kind of like, it's not that vivid language, but it's like, hey, maybe we should reorganize the CIA, And Arthur Schlesinger, liberal fellow, was kind of making this, not really making the case to Kennedy that they should reorganize it, but here's the problem with the CIA. They conduct independent foreign policy. They make policy. They foist policy off on the president and the State Department, which is what Kennedy felt the Bay of Pigs was, that the CIA
for good reason.
Yeah, was acting like a policy-making organization, which it's not supposed to be. So in the middle of this memo, there's a page and a half that is completely redacted. So this is a memo that's written 2 years before Kennedy's assassination. So it can't really figure in the controversy about the assassination or the controversies about Oswald or the investigations. So the only thing that it can do is embarrass the CIA. And so when we go to look at that document yesterday, the page and a half of redactions remain, and literally they declassified one sentence. And so, the only thing you can conclude is that, they want to control the record of the assassination that is available to historians. And if there's things that are embarrassing in there to them, they'll keep them off the record to protect themselves. That memo is exhibit A of that impulse. So we know that's going on. They are trying to control the narrative of the assassination. The stuff that we did see that was declassified, at best, interesting detail, the kind of detail that you want to know if you're analyzing covert operations, identity of cryptonyms, identity of sources, that sort of thing. But we did a case study we looked at 33 documents that were kind of prima facie of interest to JFK researchers. And I asked around to a lot of researchers, give me a good example of it. And so we put all those together into this list. When we went to check, out of the 33, only 13 had been released in full as of yesterday, and 20 still had very significant redactions. And really, the redactions hadn't really changed at all as a result of this test. So while they tout these big numbers, if you drill down and say, well, what did that mean in terms of this, that, and the other document? Like I said, it's a shell game. They offered one thing and they gave you another.
Yeah, that's fascinating about Schlesinger. He's one of the more interesting and kind of infuriating characters in this whole debacle, because if David Talbot told me that it was reading his biography of RFK that in a way set him on the path to writing Brothers, because Schlesinger mentions in passing, oh yeah, RFK never really believed the Warren Commission. Go figure. And then later in his life, supposedly maybe on his deathbed even, he said something to the effect of like, my greatest regret was like not writing this book about the CIA that I'd meant to write. So, and like he would always say he was agnostic, but then he like endorsed JFK in Vietnam, the Newman book. He was one of the first people to actually talk about that, in the years before, saying that Kennedy was trying to pull out of Vietnam. But then he would play tennis with Helms. He was a court historian, right? And he wanted to be the historian in the court of King John. So, that was the role. Yeah, I mean, and he was very much an insider, and he protected himself by not sharing that. My favorite story is in his letters. Which were released around the time he died, he has a letter right after the assassination in which he relates a conversation that he had with Kennedy. Robert Kennedy told him about his conversation with McCone. McCone had just come back and seen the Zapruder film. So this is right after the assassination. CIA had got their hands on it right away, which nobody knew for a long time. In the letter, RFK says that McCone told him that he believed the president had been hit by gunfire from two directions, which is a natural reaction to seeing the Zapruder film. It sure looks like that. Right. So there it was. The director of the CIA had seen the Zapruder film. That was news in and of itself, right? And he thought the president had been hit by gunfire from two different directions. And Bobby Kennedy knew this, and he knew it. So it was like this knowledge of what was really going on in Dallas. People at that level talked about it. They didn't say, oh, that's a crazy conspiracy theory. No, it was like a live wire in their world, and they couldn't talk about it publicly. They couldn't talk about it till they died. So, right. Yeah. And the Tucker thing says in the Tucker, I mean, we should talk about this Tucker Carlson thing, because it just, I only saw it this morning. I guess it came out last night, but that was sort of after close of business for me, so I didn't see it online. But thankfully I get off a little bit. But I do get off the internet at some point. But he mentions a number of things about the JFK assassination and these documents, and it basically echoes some of what you were saying, although he has something more. He claims to have an inside source who's seen the documents and says really bold statements that like the CIA has been lying. And he goes as far as to say like, this isn't the country we thought we were living in, more or less. I mean, this seems to corroborate what you had that press conference recently with Rex Bradford of Mary Farrell, right? And also John Tunheim, who was on the AARB in charge of declassifying these things. What is your take on Tucker's story here?
Well, I mean, his agenda is to run down, institutions and run down the presidency. So I think that has to be seen as his, not maybe his only motivation, but a primary motivation. But I also think, if you're anti-government, it's a great story to beat up the government, because the government's, behavior is so atrocious and so suspicious. So, the CIA handed him, and the president's critics this stick to beat up Biden with. And now they can say, look, Biden's hiding who killed Kennedy, And, what's interesting is that, the CIA obviously doesn't care, right? They'd rather provoke suspicion than give up their sources and methods, Like, they don't care if people think they killed Kennedy. That's fine. They're going to do their business. They put Biden in a terrible position, I think. And I'm not sure that it's tenable in the long run because, there is a lot of public opinion about this. And, will the Republicans, one question is, will the Republicans conduct oversight hearings on the JFK Records Act now that they control the House? That could be a witch hunt. That could be very helpful. I don't know and it might not happen at all. They'd rather talk about Hunter Biden's laptop. But, the need for oversight is very real, and that's what the kind of the commonsensical reaction of the media coverage that we see now, which has turned. People come to us like at the Mary Farrell Foundation and me because we know the documents, which other people don't know, and we have a credible story to tell. Now, it might not be the story that people want to hear, that the Warren Commission was wrong. But because we're credible, we're now getting a hearing in mainstream news organizations that we never got before. That's different. Yeah. That's different.
I mean, it is very strange, and I like to try to say what I know and what I don't know when I'm in such a position. I really don't know what Tucker's angle is. It could be, as you say, that it's a partisan thing. I wonder if it's something deeper where, maybe it seems like there's so much inertia in what this country has become that nothing can act as a countervailing pressure against this kind of top-down rule. And the JFK assassination is a major part in that story. I mean, maybe my more optimistic side is that some elements are in this regime that we live under are wanting to have a kind of reckoning in order to deal with how dysfunctional the state actually is. But even as I say it, the idea of Tucker as the midwife for such a thing all seems ridiculous. So I'm just kind of baffled.
I wonder about the forces behind the scene. I think there's a lot of inertia at the CIA. And it's in the nature of compartmentalized operations, right? That you don't know what the guy at the next desk is doing, and you don't ask. And so the idea of a small plot against the president, and by small plot, I mean a handful of people, maybe 4 people, and one of whom was Lee Harvey Oswald, right? That's how small a plot I think the Kennedy assassination actually was. I mean, I think people around that knew what had happened. They knew that this was a false flag operation to blame communists for a crime as a way of generating support for invading Cuba. That's the thing that the CIA has never considered. And so they may be walking around at the CIA, and very few people have ever said, well, let's open up that box and look at that compartmentalized operation, because it's, compartmentalized and has security clearances out the wazoo, and probably only the director and one other person get to open that box, and Bill Burns is probably too busy, got a war to fight, he's got an empire to run. Bill Burns probably doesn't know anything about JFK. He was probably briefed this week. We're going to do this. Please sign this piece of paper, that sort of thing. He might have asked a few questions, but, the CIA has a vested interest in not questioning itself. And because they have impunity, nobody else gets to question them either. So, and that is dysfunctional, like you say. It's like, are there forces in the CIA that want to have that reckoning? Well, when I talk about this small plot, my thinking on the subject was very much influenced by Rolf Mowat Larsen, the former CIA guy who gave a talk about Dealey Plaza as a covert operation, which I thought was quite brilliant. And he posits a small plot of, and based on his experience running covert operations, he said, some of the most important, best operations we ever did were only known to a very, less than a handful of people, even though they might have had big implications. So I think that jibed with my thinking about Kennedy's assassination in a lot of ways. And I think it explains a lot in terms of, people didn't have foreknowledge, and they didn't necessarily have guilty knowledge. All the plotters had to do was count on them to not ask questions. And that was easy to do. People didn't want to ask questions.
Right. I mean, I as David Talbot has, I think, and other people before him, Alan Dulles seems like a major suspect, and he was out of the central in terms of like probably managing the operation, and he was out of the CIA. That means that you're talking about something that is not as neat as like Operation Ajax or something that is a clear-cut CIA operation. Additionally, you have the Treasury Secretary who runs Secret Service, Dillon, and Dillon Reed is one of the Wall Street firm that was like one of the main driving forces behind the creation of the CIA in the first place. He's a guy who was in favor of getting rid of Lumumba, in favor of getting rid of Arbenz in Guatemala. I mean, he was a guy who really epitomizes that part of the oligarchy. And so I have to think that other agencies would have been involved, but even more than that, the American oligarchy. I mean, it's like what Kennedy was doing and pissing off the people that like were the people that Fortune magazine advocates for example, like this was, it seems that there were bigger forces there. So if it's to put it all just as, oh yeah, it was the CIA. I mean, the compartmental, which I don't think you're doing. You're saying it's a small operation. I mean, would you concur that it wasn't just in the CIA?
And that takes place in a political milieu. I'm just talking about the execution of an operation where one thing happens and you make it look like something else, a covert operation. Right. And that would have been executed by intelligence professionals. Now, yes. But, if that's what happened, why did they do that? Well, opposition to Kennedy's policies, which by 1963, Kennedy was definitely moving in a dovish direction, right? You could argue about the first 2 years of his presidency. Was he a hawk? Was he a dove? But after the missile crisis, it's pretty clear he's a dove, and that it's working for him politically. He came out of the Cuban Missile Crisis, a winner. It was like Biden this time. It was like, wow, he pulled a rabbit out of a hat. The Democrats thought they were going to get creamed in large part because of Cuba. And in fact, Kennedy shoots up 15 points in the polls, and the Democrats don't lose anything in the midterm. So Kennedy carries that message into 1963. He's got a winning hand politically. Peace is good politics, he's discovering. And he's put Vietnam on hold. The generals want him to go in a big way, and he's dragging his feet. Giving them
more than that, that early October memo from Taylor, where he says all planning will be geared towards the pullout. The withdrawal plan. He says all planning. Galbraith has written a good bit about this, and and even the deputy the assistant to McGeorge Bundy, he wrote also that Galbraith is correct. The plan at the time that Kennedy was killed was a phased withdrawal from Vietnam. Yeah. So this is really, and it's never been acknowledged by the press as being that way, even as the record is out there. It's very strange.
Well, Kennedy encouraged, for political reasons, he wanted to be perceived as a hawk, right? Because that would be, that was playing to the middle, while his real sympathies were somewhat more to the left. And he played that double game on Cuba too in 1963. He's still talking about overthrowing Castro. He's still not reigning in the CIA, which is trying to do that. David and Talbot and I disagree on this. I think Bobby Kennedy might have even signed off on the plots to kill Castro. Bobby Kennedy was a real tough SOB. Before the assassination, he was radicalized by it. So I don't find that implausible. But at the same time, Kennedy cracks. He doesn't invade Cuba at the missile crisis, which infuriated the Joint Chiefs and the CIA in Miami. That's when they thought his weakness was really treacherous. He went from weak to treacherous after the missile crisis in the eyes of his critics. And then in April of 1963, he cracks down on the the Cuban exiles who are launching raids against Cuba from Miami and from Florida. And they round them all up and they give them orders and say, you can't leave Dade County without permission of INS. And
should have given them ankle bracelets and stuff too.
Yeah. And so that was like strike 3. Bay of Pigs was strike 1. Missile crisis was strike 2. The crackdown was strike 3. So, that really provoked a lot of hostility too in the CIA. So Kennedy is, and I think the way David portrays this in Brothers is affecting and was very convincing to me. The Kennedys were kind of isolated in their own government. They had powerful foes within their own government, and they didn't have a lot of protection. One thing that I think is part of that is that Kennedy's stance on civil rights, which again, first 2 years, he's dragging his feet. He's not helping the civil rights movement at all. Martin Luther King, civil rights movement is very disappointed in President Kennedy. And it's not until Medgar Evers is assassinated in June of 1963 that Kennedy finally comes out in favor of the civil rights bill. And so he finally moved, I think that had a lot to do with his loss of position within his own government, because I think because of that, he didn't have protection of law enforcement. He didn't have sympathy in the Secret Service or the Dallas police. The Dallas police was overwhelmingly anti-Kennedy because he was pro-civil rights, and Dallas was a Jim Crow town. So Kennedy is this isolated figure, very popular generally, but isolated and has powerful opponents within his own government as 1963 goes on.
Yeah. And it's notable that the Warren Commission does not include any of Kennedy's actual political allies in the U.S. political system. It's all Republicans, establishment guys like John McCloy, and then and Dulles, of course. But then the Democrats are segregationists, and the Democrats actually, even though they're segregationists, and even though the Warren Commission is presented as a unanimous opinion, even those segregationist guys who some would call them, these cracker senators or whatever, and congressmen, but they are like, well, the Richard Russell thing, he's like, I don't know if I buy this magic bullet theory. It's a load of horse pucky, right? Like, this is what they're saying. And so even then, you're pointing out now that they, that the media is treating this differently than they have. But if you actually look back at it, immediately in the aftermath, you had people like McCone saying what he said, although kept secret. You had RFK's suspicions. You had the Warren Commission itself, which had people that didn't believe what they were actually putting out. And then you have years later, the Church Committee does an investigation, and they say, yeah, the CIA and FBI were really terrible. They had a whole report on this. And then you had the House Select Committee that says it was a conspiracy. And the AARB reveals a number of things, and people like Tunheim and Gunn even make statements that the Warren Commission's really hard to defend or impossible to defend. Nobody, and yet we can't do anything about it. It's like there's this whole history of elites and the public and investigatory bodies never believing this, the two lone nuts theory that they thought about, and yet we can't do a thing about it. This is really amazing.
Yeah, the political inertia, right? As soon as Kennedy was dead, anybody who was interested in pursuing power in Washington had a choice. Are you going to pursue the truth about what happened to the president, or are you going to pursue power? And most people in Washington are there to pursue power, right?
They wouldn't have gotten there if that wasn't their orientation.
So, and that ambition can be good. People come to Washington to be good liberals, So the good liberals didn't say, oh, let's find out who killed Kennedy. They were like, no, we got to do a great society. We got to do this, that, and the other thing. And so everybody just said, we're not going to go there. And then you have the people like Dulles and Helms who were like, nothing to see here, folks. Just keep moving along. They have something to protect. And so the combination of these very respectable gatekeepers enclosing a body of secrets about what actually happened and, the natural inclination of Washington, it was like somebody told me, they said, Jeff, I know you're right, but you don't understand. In 1964, we had to do that. Kennedy was dead. There was nothing that was going to bring him back. It was the patriotic thing to do, was to put it behind us. And, kind of emotionally and psychologically, I can understand that. It was like people were scared. Is this going to cause World War III? We don't want that. Let's not investigate.
That was baked into the cake, right? The World War III threat.
Yeah, exactly. So
Yeah.
But the point you're making about but the decomposition of the story has always been visible,
Yeah.
And it's interesting how that story came out, because one of the first real tests of the Freedom of Information Act, which was passed in 1966 and signed by Johnson, was when JFK researchers wanted to get the Warren Commission documents. And at first the government was like, forget it, and people said, no, Congress passed this law and it says, you actually have to do this. And people were shocked, it's like, no, you can't make us do that. And they fought the Freedom of Information Act was fought on grounds of defending the Warren Commission for a long time. And the courts eventually ruled that no, the Freedom of Information Act did apply. And that's when we first started to get the transcripts of the commission's proceedings and all that stuff that had been locked up all along. But, that story was bottled up right from the get-go because nobody wanted those kind of deliberations that Russell and Hale Boggs were talking. Nobody in the government wanted that out.
I find the Kennedy assassination, as I know you've spent a lot of time on it, but it just gives you a window into that time period. I don't have any boomer nostalgia for it because I wasn't alive then, but I don't really have an emotional attachment to these people in the same kind of way. But in terms of the forces at work there, it's just this view into the way that this country works, and then when you understand it, then it helps you to make sense of the things like Vietnam, how the Vietnam War could happen, Indonesia, what happens in Indonesia. I mean, basically, you can make sense of a whole lot of things because it reveals so much about the structure of our society and our civilization. So if it's what is going to happen if they actually do admit this? I mean, do you have any predictions as to where this is going to go with these I mean, they are going to release these in full. Isn't the Biden position that they're going to release them in full, totally unredacted soon, or is he going to keep punting?
The wording of the Biden memo is very soft, and they've got till June 30th, but they've also got license to kick the can past that. So I think they're going to keep kicking the can down the road. I think it will be something like a political confrontation, or a cultural confrontation like Oliver Stone's JFK, that will put the forces into play that will result in something changing. We at the Mary Farrell Foundation have sued Biden and the National Archives to enforce these records, and we have a whole sophisticated legal theory behind it. And the Administrative Procedures Act, and ministerial duties and discretionary duties and all of that. But I think that the use of the lawsuit is not that we'll win in the court of law, but that we could win in the court of public opinion. And that's what will force the government to do something it doesn't want to do. I'm not really sure the federal courts can, overcome the National Security Agency's built-in power into our legal system on their own. But, if Congress weighed in and this became a fuss, I think something more could happen. I was on Mike Isikoff's Yahoo News show this morning, and he said, where's this all going? Will we be arguing about this in 100 years? And of course, they all say, we'll never know. We'll never know. That's the usual. I said, I think it's going to be all over in 2067. That's when the interviews with Jackie Kennedy and Robert Kennedy with William Manchester will be released according to the deed of gift. And I think in those, and there's also 5 letters that Jackie wrote to Lyndon Johnson after the assassination. And I think in those letters and in those interviews, Bobby and Jackie Kennedy said very clearly to Manchester, we don't believe Jack was killed by this silly communist, as Jackie said, that he was killed by his enemies. And they said that on more than one occasion, as David showed in his book. But I think when we have historians have those whole things, I'll probably be dead, but you might see it. When we have those whole things in front of us, I think, and we get out of the Cold War context and we get out of our political polarities today, we have to look at it with a distance of time and with some knowledge about how CIA operations were organized in 1963. And we've already got a lot of that, but in 50 more years with this kind of evidence, I think it's going to be pretty obvious. And I think the consensus will be, yeah, Kennedy was killed by enemies in his own government, in the Pentagon and CIA. And maybe we'll know more about who that was. But I do think that in the long run, history will converge on the truth. Maybe that's an optimistic reading of things, but I do think that. 2067. So I won't be here, but you will.
So is that something that anybody in the Kennedy family has any discretion over or any ability to influence? I mean, is this a provision that's in the actual Kennedy family sort of, I don't know what the term is, but it would be out of the purview of the government, and it's more of a question of things that were provisions of their wills or other agreements that they struck with Manchester and with whoever's in possession, like the Lyndon Johnson Library, or who has those letters?
The letters, the transcripts, the tapes, and the interviews are held by the library at Wesleyan University, where Manchester went to school. He deposited them there under a deed of gift, 100 years, that they could be opened in 100 years. And that deed of gift was executed by Manchester, Robert Kennedy, and Jackie Kennedy. If anybody had the ability to override that deed of gift, it would be Caroline. And she will never do that. It's her mother. That was her mother's wishes. I can't imagine that she would, defy her mother's wishes. So I don't think that can happen. The JFK Records Act also has a provision which says this law does not apply to materials that are covered by a deed of gift. And so the law itself says that the JFK Records Act does not apply to those records. So, to me, that it seems impossibly out of reach. There's no way Caroline Kennedy's going to buck her mother, and it's written into the law. So 2067. We're going to have.
But we already know what Jackie and Robert thought about it, and their word is not. It's not as though they're going to have proof that to add to the story, and we already do know what they thought about it. So.
Yeah, but just imagine, Jackie in her own words, and also, she talked to Manchester, and this has never been made public. She talked to Manchester about the experience of being in the limousine. And having her husband die in her arms, and when that is made public, that it's going to be very personal. It's going to be very powerful. That's going to have a kind of impact that just knowing what we know about Bobby and Jackie, what David found out by talking to a lot of RFK associates, what we know intellectually will have this visceral, emotional power that will, I think, shape the story.
Yeah. I mean, we already have the Seibert and O'Neill and Clint Hill talking about a huge exit wound in the back of Kennedy's head. And we've got the video that shows him going backwards. It's just, I would be very curious to read these things or to see them come out. And I'd be excited for them to be available. And yet it still is the fact that it's even necessary also seems, there's just so much evidence of between the Parkland testimony, the Bethesda testimony, the FBI guys, the Secret Service guy, it's just there's so much. But the other part of that is that look at that photograph of the back of Kennedy's head that seems to be clearly doctored, the one that has that little pinky-sized hole in the back of his head. I mean, if they can manipulate, evidence in that sort of way, are any of these documents really safe at this point, or do you worry about that?
Well, Tink Thompson, who was one of the original JFK investigators, who wrote 6 Seconds in Dallas, was actually the first person to analyze the Zapruder film in a kind of modern forensic way, frame by frame, something the Warren Commission incredibly never did. The CIA did it, and Josiah Thompson did it, but the Warren Commission never did it. So he says that, he went on to become a private investigator and do, huge insurance cases and, so top of the line private investigator. And he said, in all the cases I worked on, some massive, fraud conspiracy or something like that, we'd develop a case, either he'd be defending the company or working with, plaintiffs. And, we figure out, the conspiracy sort of looked like this and here's who was involved. And then, 5 years later, when people have pleaded out and more discovery and all that, over time, the picture coheres and the evidence falls into place and you see, what you understand better. And the story of what actually happens becomes clearer with the accumulation of evidence. He said, so why hasn't that happened with JFK? And he said, the most likely explanation to him is some of what we think is evidence isn't evidence, right? Like maybe the autopsy material. I mean, he wasn't being specific about that, but I think that's a good way to think about it is, why is this case so confounding? Well, some of the things that we think are evidence, may not be evidence. And,
it's all the state's evidence.
Right. And so
but the state is the main suspect.
Right. So you look at the monkey business in Mexico City, that could be, it's a very kind of pregnant file when you look at it now, all those cables and stuff like that. But, there might have been 3 or 4 more cables that have just been taken out of there, that would change the complexion of what those documents mean. And I'm pretty sure that happened at some point, that certain things were removed from the record or added to the record, bogus evidence was added to the record. So that has, generated this confusion.
Yeah, I have a more specific question to ask you about these files, but before I'm going to, while we're on this topic, do you think it's plausible that the Zapruder film itself has some minor alterations to it? I tend to, without being someone who, I have not, nor do I ever want to be able to quote chapter and verse about frame, whatever. But like, I do feel like there's the case that, what's the guy who was on the Douglas Horn, the case that he makes of small alterations, perhaps a black patch on the back of the head and then something added to the front, that weird blob that doesn't quite make sense when you think about the other evidence in question. I mean, do you think that that's possible that even the Zapruder film has been altered to some degree?
I mean, I guess I would say I don't believe that it was. I mean, the story that Doug developed, and, I give respect to Doug's position. I'm not sure I totally believe it, but, the CIA did get their hands on that film much faster than anybody knew. And they did do a massive analysis of it. And his interviews with Dino Brugioni, an indisputable source about CIA photography, the master of photography at the CIA for 25 years, that's very compelling. And so you can see that it is theoretically possible that it did happen. I spent some time with people who were had blown the thing up and had 10,000 pixel resolution and, here, look, here's the patch and all that. And, they had a pretty sophisticated demonstration and they said, but we need to perfect it and we need to do all this. And, they never have. And so, it's possible, but I don't think that they made the case. And so I can't assume that it's true. And also, like you say, minor alteration. I mean, you look at that film, it sure looks like he was hit from the front, and that's what Dr. McClellan and the other Dallas doctors said when they saw the wound and they saw the film. Yeah, he was definitely hit from the front. So, no. The short answer to your question, no, I don't think the Zapruder film was altered.
Yeah. I could be off about the details about this, but what I understand happened was that group that you're speaking of that had these super high quality scans, they produced a whole documentary using those. And then at some point, the sixth floor was able to step in and stop that film from being distributed. They asserted some sort of copyright, priority over that. I don't know.
They would have had to pay astronomical fees to get the rights to the film.
Yeah, something to that effect. So I'm agnostic on that too. I kind of think that really would have been. I'm agnostic, but I lean toward minor alterations because of that blob in the front to me of his head. If everybody knows, if there's so much evidence that it was an exit wound, then it would have been a small entrance wound, and that does not make sense. And it's something that you can see them kind of adding on, and it's really weird. But that is my opinion as a guy who has looked at some video pictures, not as
I'm no photo,
the master of.
I'm no photo expert. And the other thing I would say is, and this is what you hear from cops, is, when the human body gets hit by gunfire, like weird things happen, and so Dealey Plaza, it's not a scientific experiment. We can't recreate so people say, oh, the body could, flip backwards. And it's like, I doubt it, but, because weird things happen, I couldn't say it's impossible, it's like, so. Yeah, there's
so much weirdness around this. I mean, I read reports of people back in the 70s, like after this aired, they were shooting deer and stuff and like videotaping the way the head went. And like, we're doing but I feel like it's a microcosm of like a number of things. Number one, just the high strangeness of it all, but also the impact that it had on, I mean, it's an exercise in kind of democracy in a way that people would be like, it can't be what happened. Hey, look, I've got a dead deer and a gun. I'm going to do my part or something. I mean, it's kind of amazing and kind of heartwarming, a little weird too. But then it's also weird to think like, I guess I'm sort of a part of that effort, me and those deer hunters.
The growth of the skepticism about the Warren Commission, I mean, it's part and parcel of, what we mean by the 60s, this rejection of authority, and what people forget now, especially, is, within 2 years, by the fall of 66, early 67, major publications were defecting from the Warren Commission. Both Look and Life magazine called for new investigations. Serious news publications with national audience, that was like the establishment itself was splitting over Vietnam, in those years. What the godsend to the government was Garrison, who didn't have much of a case. He smelled a rat and he thought he'd put some people on trial and people would start talking about,
Instead, they start dying.
Yeah. And so then you have the CIA counteroffensive with the countering critics of the Warren Commission memo. And at this time when the establishment is under siege, beset by its own internal divisions, beset by its own children, basically, that sort of doubled the impulse to circle the wagons around the Warren Commission, because it was like shit was falling apart. We had to stand firm. So, I have an amusing story on the JFK Facts blog about a man who knew Oswald, Ernest Titovitz. He was a young student in Minsk when Oswald was there, and he spoke English, so he and Oswald became friends. And he wrote a book about it, very interesting book about Oswald before the assassination. But anyway, Titovitz says, Norman Mailer calls him up in the 90s and says, oh, I understand you knew Oswald, I want to come and see you. And so Titovitz is very flattered, the great American writer, progressive, wants to meet him and all that. And David Lifton, the guy who wrote the book Best Evidence, about the first book that really raised real questions about the JFK autopsy. Lifton was friends with Titovitz from his own JFK research. And he went to him and said, do not trust Norman Mailer. That guy's out to convict Oswald. He's out to convict your friend. And Titovitz says in this story, read it, he says, I never trusted the guy. And he said, and he thanked David Lifton, who died last week. He thanked David Lifton. He said, because, otherwise he might have fallen for Norman Mailer.
Yeah, because Mailer was originally kind of a critic of the Warren Commission, but then he writes Oswald's Ghost or something like that in the 90s after the JFK movie. And it was very strange, right? Wasn't that the general trajectory of the guy? Or was he ever, was he a critic as I remembered early? Wasn't he initially a critic?
Yeah, he was. He just, he wouldn't go that far, and he was scared of, being labeled a conspiracy theorist. So he sort of walked back from the abyss and developed this whole, cosmic theory about Oswald. And it's all kind of, to me, it's all kind of BS. It's all imputed. It's not really, it's not really what the evidence shows. So
yeah. I mean, but there's even when you said Life magazine was like defecting in '67, and I do recall that the Look magazine guy, one of the editors, wasn't there a strange death around that? Like one of the guys was looking to do more on this, and then he just drops dead of a heart attack. Maybe something related to Garrison. I sort of remember that, but set that aside for a second. Okay. Life magazine was like, that's the company that was like the official PR arm of the American deep state, basically. I mean, they wrote the American Century essay, and the Council on Foreign Relations, CFR, loose dude, and C.D. Jackson went and snatched up the tape. And then Epstein was a critic too, but he was also an Angleton guy. And then also you have Norman Mailer, who's supposed to be a critic, but that ends up, I mean, it makes you wonder how many of the critics have been
corrupted.
A way to get out ahead of the story here in some ways. Like if this is just one of their current MOs, which I do think it is a CIA thing to have this sort of limited hangout or to control the critical community. It seems like exactly the kind of thing they would do. Do you have any take on that or?
Well, it is interesting. When I did the Angleton book, Angleton was spying on the JFK critics in the late 60s and early 70s. He would send people to their meetings and, keep up with what they were doing. And he certainly infiltrated the Garrison project. And one of the ways that they infiltrated it was by posing as supporters, which was a typical Angleton tactic. So, people have talked about that in the research community. I mean, I never saw like a case that I felt like that aroused my suspicion in that way. Maybe I'm just a trusting person.
What about Epstein though? What about Epstein and his relationship with Angleton?
I think Ed Epstein's a very smart, idiosyncratic guy. He became friends with Angleton. He didn't want to be perceived as a nut. He wanted to be an insider. It was all very interesting. Angleton was credible to Epstein. Yeah. And, I mean, the Kennedy assassination is tough because it is a kind of epistemological test, right? How do you know what the truth is? And how do we...
How does anybody know anything about anything?
And so, when somebody's like, people say, oh, how can you believe that crap? It's like, I'm very modest, like people come to life with all different experiences. And if somebody like really believes in the Warren Commission, I don't question their motives. It's like, that's fine. To me, it's almost like religion. It's like, that's fine. You're a Muslim. I'm not a Muslim, but I'm okay with you being a Muslim. I'm okay with you being a single bullet guy. I'm not going to hold it against you. But because the subject is so important and it provokes these passionate feelings, we're always, being tolerant, and then we're at each other's throats. How can you believe that crap about Oswald?
I mean, the magic bullet, when you even hear like J. Edgar Hoover saying, I'm not sure that's plausible. I mean, that's like, of course it's not J. Edgar Hoover. But then like other people will believe, we'll try to defend it. Or John McAdams would write like the single bullet fact.
Yeah.
So don't call it a theory and don't call it the magic bullet. So there you go. But as far as them using things like this, I mean, I have this. There's a story that I've put out on Al McCoy and Peter Dale Scott, and I'm not saying this to disparage Al McCoy, but if you look back at what actually happened with that and Peter's original war conspiracy book, Al McCoy's book became a bestseller. And there was he got to interview like Lucien Conein and Ed Lansdale, and he had a DEA guy help him also. And then he gets all this publicity because there's this New York Review of Books story about how the CIA tried to like take him down and kill his book and everything else. The outcome is that this book becomes really popular. Peter's book was pushed. They delayed the release for years to the maximum possible because Bobbs Merrill, the publisher, just did it. Right. Uh-huh. And then later we find and they push it. So it actually comes out after McCoy's book, and then it kind of disappears. And it had the same sort of heroine story, only it was deeper and kind of more explosive. It disappears, the book, more or less. Al's book becomes a bestseller. He goes on to have get a tenured position at Wisconsin, which is not what happened to Gary Webb, if you recall. So that's interesting. But years later, I find on the CIA website, Peter's 1971 Ramparts article that he had mailed to Ramparts on the Air America heroin story well before it appeared in any other magazine outlet or anything like that. And the CIA had a meeting over it, and they posted it on their website, and the article never made it to Ramparts. And the story doesn't come out. And Peter's book, which has this story in it, gets delayed. And the legal counsel for Bobbs Merrill, the company that delayed Peter's book all that time, was William Harvey, who had retired to work for Bobbs Merrill. Right. And they delayed that book. And then that story actually does come out, but it comes out with Al McCoy writing a less explosive take on it. I'm not saying I have respect for Al McCoy in general, and Peter considers him a friend, but that story to me is amazing, because I think that they actually had a plan to like deal with this information and kind of diffuse it as best they could, and it involved exposing a lot of it. And that's the way that it happened. So I put almost nothing past them, and yet I don't want to go around thinking that way all the time, because it would drive me a little batty.
I read the book in a long time, but to me, the way McCoy describes it, where, it was very easy to talk about these things if you were in Vietnam, if you were in Phnom Penh, it was and so people talked about it because it was just part of the fabric of life. When you extracted yourself from that and came back to Paris or Washington, he mentions this, I don't know if you remember this in the book, all of a sudden, these are not conversations that you have. But I found it convincing that McCoy had kind of gotten into the story, gotten access to people like Lou Conine, who didn't think twice. Of course we deal dope. That's how we fund our covert ops. What are you talking about? These rough-hewn characters who were candid with him. Was that a CIA project? It's interesting that Harvey was at Bobbs Merrill, and, did that hurt Peter? I don't know. Like you, I think once you start thinking about things that way, you can definitely. So, Aaron, I'm going to have to go. I got another call to do.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I was going to ask about if you thought it was more related to Cuba, or if you thought it was more related to the mole hunt, the Fair Play for Cuba thing. Do you think the documents in question that the guy's referring to related to Tucker are related to the mole hunt, or do you think it's more likely it was FPCC?
I think I think it was done in the guise of a COINTELPRO style operation run by the CIA against the FPCC. I don't, Angletonian madness makes anything possible, but I don't think it goes back to the mole hunt.
Thank you very much for doing this today. I really appreciate it. If I can do anything else to help you publicize this, let me know. I'm at your disposal. So thanks again.
When do you put this out?
I'm going to put it out today.
Okay, great. I'll look for it. Thanks.
All right. See you later. Thanks again. Bye-bye. Thanks to Dana Chavarria for engineering the audio, and also to Seamus McGinnis for putting together a video version. And as ever, thanks to Mock Orange for the music. If you are not already a subscriber and you want to learn more about the hidden history of the U.S. and the clandestine state, please consider subscribing to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. We have a whole lot of material covering many suppressed historical episodes from the world's most powerful empire. It can be grim material, but that's why we're out here, chasing the light.